Okay, hi. I'm Matt Greenfield, and I was the ADR director and writer for the English language of Neon Genesis Evangelion. And with me is Wade Shemwell.
Who handled ugh, the audio restoration process.
This is why he's behind the camera, folks. Uh, this has been an interesting project. Ava's consumed a good chunk of my life at this point. It was one of the earliest series that we actually dubbed here at Industrial Smoke and Mirrors. And when it was originally recorded, we were in an ancient studio. It wasn't ancient physically; it was brand new, but the technology, by today's standards,
Was ancient.
was
Absolutely.
ancient. Just the sheer magnitude of revolutions in audio technology in the 9 years since we built that studio and where we are now.
Correct. I mean, there's been changes in the entire signal chain, but really, it was the end product that was suffering. But at the time, it wasn't suffering. But if you're going to re-release something 10 years later, 9 years later, then obviously you're going to have to perform some restoration process.
Right. I mean, the biggest thing is that when Ava was originally released, we were working with stereo mixes, and there's a lot of limitations to doing a stereo mix. And probably the biggest thing was that at the time, the materials that we received were basically the music and the effects mixed together in what they call a premix. And you can tweak with that somewhat, but there's always the point where you're like, okay, if you bring it up too loud to get the effects more dominant, then the music gets too loud, or vice versa if you bring it down. So you're always fighting that. Fortunately, on the Platinum Project, we've gotten the new masters that were created for Evangelion Renewal in Japan, and everything is separated out. Every element is there for us to tweak individually, and that's made a lot of things possible that weren't possible on the original series mix. The fact that you can put things around in 5.1, so multiple levels of conversation can go on simultaneously without stomping on each other, because you've got the separation of it being behind you or to the left and to the center. And also the fact that the clarity of the sound can now be manipulated much more accurately. You can get everything
Actually
exactly
perform
the
a real
level.
mix.
Right. And what it really has let us do is go back and take the original performances and really present them the way they sounded when they were recorded, as opposed to the way the limitations of the materials at the time let us get away with. I mean, we did the best we could at the time. The other big difference is just the actual recording process. The technology that we used back then, basically we could record audio, and if it was slightly off, you could do a very slight compression on it if it was a tiny bit too long. If it was too short, too bad, actor had to go ahead and do it again. What we found now with the Platinum Project is that because the animation was remastered, that quite often the animation doesn't match what was originally there exactly.
So it required a great deal of resyncing, but the tools, thankfully now, are available to us to make that sync possible. Whereas, I understand at the time they weren't. But it's another thing interesting to point out at this point. Since we are dealing with the 5.1 mix, the majority of the dialogue is sitting in the center channel, which makes it very apparent if there's a flaw or if there's something that may not have been caught in the original stereo mix. And because of that, there had to be a great deal of restoration that went into the original dialogue mix. Along with the resyncing, there was a great deal of noise reduction. We re-edited the entire show, and hopefully it came out much better. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
a lot of it was again just the technology available at the time. One of the big things is that the actors have to hear what's going on while they're recording, so they've got headphones on, and although it wasn't really audible at the time, going back now with the better clarity that we have, we can hear ghosting coming in from the original soundtrack through the headphones, and all that had to be sonically cleaned out. Because the music is no longer in the same place, the effects are no longer in the same place. Originally, it was not an issue because the dialogue was where the dialogue was, and it covered up itself.
right. There's headphone bleed, but I mean, if you've got a speaker that's predominantly reproducing dialogue, and you've got such a much wider soundstage at this point, then those little flaws are apparent, and it was it's a challenging process, but ultimately rewarding. I've been doing largely nothing but this for what, 6 months now?
6 months now, and you're about what, halfway through the series
A
now,
little
roughly?
bit over halfway through the
Which
series.
is, we were originally taking about 3 to 4 weeks to record a pair of episodes. So you're actually taking about the same amount of time remixing it as we were taking recording the dialogue. And this was a big decision we had up front, was whether or not we wanted to just go back and re-record the entire show. But because the voices had become so associated with the characters, and because a lot of those voice actors are no longer with us, that is, they've moved. I don't think any of them have passed away quite yet, although one always wonders when they disappear on you. We've actually had a number of actors have just disappeared. We actually had one of the original Tojis ran away with the circus, if you can believe that.
Now, that brings up an interesting point, though, because for the director's cut, we did have to re-record some new scenes, and it was challenging to try to make those new takes with the old takes mixed, because the sound quality was night and day. And it, more often than not, I ended up dirtying up a new take a little bit, re-EQing it, and then giving the old takes as much love and care as I could, and hopefully somewhere in the middle they would meet to where it was a uniform and consistent product.
Right. And it was a big decision, which we made on the director's cut, to go back and re-record. We were very worried about the entire concept of doing a George Lucas and changing things, and really wanted to avoid that because we had worked so tightly with Gynax and King Record on the original production, making sure everything stayed dead on to what the original
If it's not broken,
interpretations
don't
were.
fix it.
Exactly. So finally, even though it would have been about the same amount of time, we opted, we're going to go ahead and remix the original tracks, clean them up, and it sounds phenomenal. It really does sound really, really good. I've been quite surprised at how good some of the performances were that were kind of buried in the background. A lot of the supporting stuff, the things going over the PA systems are completely lost in the stereo mix. Now, we have had to go back and re-record a few things. There were a few lines that, after the fact, people from Gynax and King contacted us saying, okay, we missed this, could you fix it? No, guys, we've already recorded and shipped the product, but we have gone back and fixed that. There was specifically there was a Misato line referring to mental contamination that the translator originally got wrong, and it called it brain damage, and we fixed that. We've re-recorded all the coming attractions, because when the coming attractions were originally recorded, we didn't have the actual music that was originally used, so we had a different piece of music that was given to us with a totally different beat, and the coming attractions were actually longer in the original version. So Alison Keith has come back and recorded a bunch of her dialogue.
Luckily enough, Allison is still available.
Yeah, Yvonne Aguirre came in and redid a bunch of the background things over the rear channels and so on, since she was one of the original voices doing that sort of thing. And it's kind of been an interesting game of trying to figure out where do we draw the line. Basically, we've had a couple of guys sit there with the original mixes, the translations, and the current versions going back and forth. Okay, is anything really different here? What is not in the script that's been added?
So actually, we had some guys that came up with a system to actually listen to them concurrently, and I mean, it's
You think
very
Ava is hard to
difficult.
follow, in and of itself. Just imagine trying to watch two versions of it that are slightly different at the same time.
Right, on two different audio channels, and trying to.
We haven't seen those guys in a while, have we? They kind of vanished.
Nah. Well, I started it, and then I delegated, as it were. But no, I mean, it all comes down to giving this show what it deserves, because this is a huge show. The following is huge. The fan base is amazingly loyal, and I mean, they will catch it if something is not given the proper care. And so it really is worth it in the end, hopefully, for the fans and for us as engineers and directors, producers. So
Well, I mean, let's just talk about exactly what's actually been done. If you see the system behind us, and I'm sure they'll cut in a close-up here, this is kind of basically where it all works. And what happens is the original audio was all backed up on digital tapes, 8-track tapes, but it was simply linear recordings of the actual show. And what Waits had to do is go in, listen to each of those channels, and every time there's a sound, cut it out specifically, clean it up, and put it back into sync.
Right, where it belongs. And sometimes, as Matt's previously stated, the sync has changed on the video ever so slightly. You probably would never know if you haven't, had video side by side, but it has. And we tried to resync these things, and we tried to improve upon the original sync, because we have the tools to do so now.
I think really what's the biggest thing is then you go in, the voices were all recorded in a studio where basically there was no background sound, just very minimal reflection off the voices. So basically the voices hanging in space. And originally all the environments were provided electronically with reverbs and so on. And that's where I think the remix has really completely changed a lot of the nature of the scenes, because the depth to which we're able to do that, to place a character in space, it's not just an echo behind, there's slap coming back and forth from the beginning to the end, and the actual environments are much more subtle.
Well, it also comes along with technology. It also comes along with having a 5.1 environment to work in. You're not trapped into such a small field as a stereo field. You can create an environment that really does, in some ways, simulate a real environment. And that's the entire show has been remixed in that way. What I got off of tape were dry, unedited voice takes, and so the process started all over from there. And it was interesting trying to recreate some of the ambiances. And the Japanese mix is very interesting. It's not what we typically see in American mixes, but it's a very interesting mix. They've got a lot of spatiality that's...
Right, and of course this is the remix of the Japanese version, not the original version, which was also a straight stereo mix.
They did a lot of re-recording of certain things that we did not do, but at the same time, I don't think the show suffers for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then the other thing that I think that really changes the nature of the show is just the fact that we've got all these years of understanding Ava, and we can put in some more subtle touches. You've actually had an interesting experience with Ava, because the first thing you ever saw was the end of Ava.
Right. I started on the director's cut, so my first experience was, if anyone's familiar with the show, which obviously you will be, the last 3 episodes. I didn't know what was going on. I called Matt. I was like, what's going on in this show? I said, how should this be handled? And he just kind of laughed when it's Ava. I mean...
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when I was originally doing the show, I knew where it was going. I had scripts and materials for most of the show, but I only had copies off of television for the last 10 episodes. So we didn't really have accurate translations for that. So I knew where it was going roughly. And I was getting feedback from King and Gynax specifically on the scripts. Once we finished the show, it was like, okay, I really could have nuanced that little bit just a little bit more to emphasize, because when you realize the entire thing, and if you're watching this for the first time, the show for the first time, you're watching this, plug your ears, because the whole thing is actually a loop. And you find out that the rest of the show is actually flashback from the last two episodes, which is why every time you see Shinji's little super DAT recorder flashing, it says 25, 26, 25, 26, implying that actually the entire thing is going to be explained in episodes 25 and 26. And you realize that most of what you're seeing is a flashback as opposed to what's happening, and that there's a lot of double entendres. Because I knew generally where things were going, I was able to work that into the script properly. But in terms of how much it should be inflected, we've actually been able to go back and bring a line down or bring a line up a little bit more to make it more obvious that this is a key point. Especially Ritsuko has a lot of dialogue that's very telling in retrospect. Once you've watched Ava, go back and watch it again and listen to her dialogue, listen to some of the things that Gendo says, some of the things that Ray says. Those are really the only 3 characters who really know everything that's going on. The other thing you learn real quickly is that Kaji talks like he knows what's going on, but he really only knows part of it. Misato only knows part of it, and part of what she believes is inaccurate. And we've been able to basically focus a little bit more attention on that in retrospect.
And I had to trust Matt on much of this because, as he stated, I got the director's cut first, and if you, it's just I mean, it was confusing, but I was given a lot of freedom to do a lot of interesting things with the ADR, and I think that it helped a little bit just to break up some of the monotony instead of like having a verb over every scene.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
having
things
some
like
more.
the Zele Council, I think, really, they play very differently now because it's not the single monotonous reverb type effect on every single voice. There's a subtlety between them because those characters actually developed, even though you only saw them about every 7 episodes. There is a change in the relationship of all these monolithic blocks or the people behind them when you see them.
Right. Well, I was given the choice to watch the entire show first. I chose not to do it because I knew I was going to have to do this. And it works better for me in a show working as a mixer to let it develop and let those things develop because it tends to have more of a natural flow to it and it doesn't seem so contrived. If I had it to do over again, I may have watched the entire thing because this is a very unique, involved show. But I prefer to work in a very linear fashion and not peak, because to me that helps. You don't want to be too big by realizing something that may be happening and you don't want to telegraph it unconsciously. So
Yeah, the whole trick in Ava is really it's underplaying. I remember when I first started seeing the other language dubs, which we accumulated for the first DVD release, and really loving the French dub. And my French is very, very poor. But there was something about the way they played it, with everything extremely underplayed, that really seemed to work for Ava. And that was something I tried to bring into the director's cuts a little bit more. So when you're watching the director's cuts episodes, you'll see some slight inflection changes, especially on a couple of the episodes where we basically had to re-record everything because the original quality was very, very compromised.
those were good days of my life. But yeah, that was, as I was previously mentioning, it was very difficult trying to get consistency with entire characters having been re-recorded for entire episodes, mixing with audio that obviously wasn't, and having to make it work as reactionary. And it's a challenge, but it came off and it played. I actually liked the way that it came off in the end. I mean, it's been a while since I've seen it, but it'd be interesting to go back and see exactly how it plays now.
Yeah, well, you're going to be seeing it again here
I'm-
soon,
that's
since we
very
do the
true.
5.1 remix version. So, and that's kind of the nature of Ava. Every time you think you're finished with it, it comes back, and I'm sure we'll be back again when we do the high definition version in a couple of years. Even though theoretically there is no other version coming.
Yes, well,
It's Evangelion, and we're sure it'll come back.
I'm positive of it.